Welcome to Christianity's African Roots, Session 8. Africa purges church dysfunctions, mostly in its northeast, that resulted from persecution, early 4th century AD. Here's a review of what we surveyed in our previous session. In Session 7, we considered the persecution and martyrdom accounts in and around Libya and Egypt. Split in Christendom over ethical concerns of African congregations in the West. Edict of Toleration. Dissenting African congregations. Edict of Milan. Dante's appeals to Roman Emperor Constantine. Constantine's aggression towards the Donatists. Now, here's what we'll survey today. Significant Christian activity and individuals in Northeast Africa. Africa's and Africans' contributions to Christianity before the Council of Nicaea. Damage report on persecutions effect upon African congregations. The First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Ethiopia adopts Christianity as its religion of the state. Let's begin with significant activity and individuals in Northeast Africa. The significant Christian activity and individuals in Northeast Africa that we're going to consider are the excommunication of Deacon Arius of Libya, excommunication of Melitius, Bishop of Lycopolis, the revered Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, and Didymus the Blind. Persecution resulted in the loss of scholars, teachers, deacons, and bishops through death, banishment, or hiding. This left huge gaps in truth teaching and church practices. And with the end of persecution, the challenge was to repair the errors in teachings and practices. But this repair began almost 2 decades before both Constantine was sole emperor of Rome and before the First Nicene Council. So beginning with Deacon Arius of Libya. Arius, a Berber, presumed to be born in Cyrene about 280 AD, was a respected theologian, ascetic, and leader in the Christian church in Alexandria, Egypt. He was ordained a deacon by Peter I of Alexandria in 306 AD. He believed that Jesus Christ, as God the Son, was created by God the Father at a point in time, and that his nature was distinct and subordinate to the Father's. Arius' teachings were popular in many areas of the world, but most prevalent in Africa. His teachings were believed to be from his time as a student at the exegetical school in Antioch. His teachings were in direct conflict with teachings of the catechetical school there in Alexandria, which led to his excommunication from the church. However, he also disputed the readmission into the church of those who had lapsed in their faith during persecution. Next, we have the excommunication of Melitius, Bishop of Lycopolis. In Upper Egypt, near Thebes, Melitius formed an ascetic Christian church that also had concerns about readmitting into the church persons who had lapsed in faith during persecution. Peter I, the Bishop of Alexandria, was his archbishop. Melitius refused to accept in communion those who had lapsed in their faith when forced by Romans, which was in contrast to the earlier willingness of bishops, and that is to accept back into communion those who seem to have truly repented. He was accused of ordaining clergy and bishops in Christian communities outside of his jurisdiction. These communities had been deprived of their pastors as a result of Roman persecution. He was also accused of fomenting discord by his criticism of the light penances imposed by Peter I on lapsed Christians. He also charged Peter I, his superior, with abandoning the community of the faithful to flee from persecution himself. Melitius was deposed around 306 AD by Peter I, Bishop of Alexandria, for refusing to abdicate his jurisdiction and ministerial authority. In 308 AD, under Roman Emperor Galerius' persecution, he was condemned to work in the mines in Palestine. He returned to Alexandria, Egypt, after the Edict of Toleration in 311 AD, but now with the prestigious title and the power of a confessor for having endured the punishing exile. Next, the first of three key individuals who took on the challenge to repair the errors in teachings and practices was Alexander of Alexandria, the one who had excommunicated Arius. Alexander was Egyptian, and little is known about his early years, but he was the 19th Coptic Orthodox Pope of Alexandria, Egypt, who succeeded from Mark the Evangelist. He mentored his own successor, who we will talk about next. Alexander was designated to preside over the first Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, but he then delegated the responsibility to his deacon, Athanasius. Alexander was commissioned at the first Council of Nicaea to compute a new date for Easter for use in place of the Hebrews' newly modified calculation. And he was praised at the first Council of Nicaea. Alexander had witnessed the bloody persecution of Christians by Emperors Diocletian and Galerius. His death is unknown, but according to some sources, on his deathbed, he was said to have named Athanasius as his successor. So next is the second of the three who took on the challenge to repair the errors in teachings and practices. And that was none other than Bishop Alexander's successor, Athanasius, his deacon. Athanasius was an Egyptian. He had a liberal education in secular learning, and he was thoroughly instructed in the scripture. In 312 AD, Bishop Alexander of Alexandria took Athanasius into his household as a companion, secretary, and later as a deacon. He lived there as a son. Athanasius' contributions: he was an early church father, theologian, and writer, and Bishop of Alexandria. He also wrote the biography of Anthony the Great. He was the chief spokesman during the first Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. He provided clarification about the essence of Jesus' nature and refuted false teachings, particularly those teachings of Arius. By 367 AD, Athanasius had identified the 27 books of the New Testament, what we have today, 1,200 years before King James had commissioned the compilation of the Bible. Athanasius died peacefully in bed, surrounded by his clergy and faithful supporters. He had been exiled 5 times by 4 Roman emperors and spent 17 of the 45 years he had served as Bishop of Alexandria in exile. Being dark complexion and short in stature, his enemies named him Black Dwarf. In Justo Gonzalez's book, The Story of Christianity, he states, among those who were present at the Council of Nicaea was a young man so dark and short that his enemies called him the Black Dwarf. Third of the 3 who took on this challenge to repair the errors in teachings and practices was Didymus the Blind. Didymus was an Egyptian, and despite becoming blind at the age of 4, before he had learned to read, he successfully mastered all of the sciences known at that time. His night studies were long and frequent, not from reading, but from listening. He wanted to gain by hearing what others had obtained by seeing. When a reader became tired and fell asleep, Didymus did not sleep himself, but reflected on what he had heard his readers say until he committed it to memory. His contributions were that he was a theologian, a writer, a math scholar, and academic dean. He helped blind people to read through his experiments with letters carved in wood. He also headed the Catechetical School of Alexandria at one point. His type of death is unknown, but he lived during the time when monasticism was one of the most significant manifestations of the Christian spirit. Anthony the Great, Amminus, Pachomius, and Evagrius Paticus were Didymus's contemporaries. Before we survey our next topic, let's inventory the contributions that Africa had made to Christianity prior to the Nicene Council of 325 AD. Because failure to inventory them could result in undue credit being assigned to Constantine or to the Nicene Council. But even worse, it could well rob Africa of her identity in church history. So let's look at those contributions. Take a look on your screen, scrolling up. The Council of Nicaea of 325 AD did not impose any ethics or faith. Its progression, its momentum, nor Christian doctrine on Africa that Africans themselves had not proposed for all of Christendom. "24 contributions of Africans or the African church to Christendom before the Nicene Council of 325 AD. So having made all of these contributions to the church, persecution left the church in the West, on both sides of the Mediterranean in the West, very dysfunctional. However, the scope of these presentations are the Christian congregations in Africa's Northwest and Northeast. Therefore, it is essential that we first understand the situation of life within these faith communities of dissenting African congregations at this point in time for two reasons. First, to suggest probable cause for the representation imposed upon the dissenting congregations at the First Nicene Council. And second, to give credence to the dissent of those congregations. So let's consider their damage report. Let's get a status on Northwest African congregations leading up to the First Nicene Council. Again, this is a damage assessment of Rome's persecution and aggressions upon early African Christians and churches through 325 AD. Some of these African congregations had departed from the church teachings, and dead or imprisoned church leaders opened the door for false teachers, and exiled or hiding clergy who were reluctant to return to their flock. And some ordinations were performed out of desperation, and believers had lapsed in their faith with greater ease to avoid persecution. And aggressive advocates for social justice had fueled splintered factions within the African church. Church clergy were susceptible to bribes, having been impoverished due to confiscated wealth, and the need to accommodate persecuted refugees from other traditions. After all, they were the church, and those who were persecuted weren't necessarily Christians, but they were accommodated by persecuted Christians. And a large and growing disenchanted, dissenting Christian population emerged. And African Christians were used by Rome to harass other Christians. All of this equals an ailing early African church. Ideally, the Nicene Council was the kind of gathering for agreeing on the repair of the damage and healing and uniting all of Christendom. This could have occurred with fair representation of all Christian churches throughout Christendom. But with no disrespect for other Christian congregations, and in keeping with the scope of this research, let's consider the actual impact that the council had on African congregations. The designated spokesperson was the revered Egyptian Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria. But as we said earlier, he delegated the responsibility to his deacon Athanasius. So the actual spokesperson was Athanasius, deacon to the Bishop Alexandria. Now, I want to list the ecclesiastic purposes of the Nicene Council. That doesn't suggest there weren't underlying political purposes as well, but I want to highlight the ecclesiastic purposes: to standardize the practices and behavior of clergy, to differentiate church teachings from false teachings, to determine how to handle unorthodox or false teachers, and to honor the ancient Libyan and Egyptian Christian traditions. And that was spelled out at the council. Given those purposes, how was Africa represented at the council? First of all, notice what we have there in red. Of the 1,800 bishops invited throughout all of Christendom to the First Nicene Council, only 318 attended. That number came from Athanasius himself, from his writings. Let's list the representatives from Africa's northeast. Representing congregations from there, from the Egyptian region, we have Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria. We have Athanasius, Deacon of Alexandria. We have Paphnutius of Thebes. We have Patama of Heraclea in Egypt. And from the Libyan Pentapolis region, we have Secundus of Ptolemy, Theonis of Marmarica, and Zephirius of Dax. Next, representing the congregations in Africa's northwest, we have Cecilian, Bishop of Carthage, whom the Donatists did not recognize. And as far as Africa's northwest, Cecilian was the sole representative of the entire region. So what were the outcomes of this council specific to Africa? It was declared that the ancient customs of Egypt, Libya, and Pentapolis be maintained, according to which the Bishop of Alexandria has authority over all those places. A condemnation of Arius and his followers as heretics. Stripping of Meletius's authority to represent the church and to nominate or ordain clergy. Honor was given to the great Egyptian bishop Alexander. At the council, a resolution was made and a letter was written to leaders in his jurisdiction, and it stated, "Welcome our fellow minister, your Bishop Alexander, with all the great honor and love. He has made us happy by his presence, and despite his advanced age, has undertaken such great labor in order that you too may enjoy peace." Also decided that all the churches were to follow a single rule for the date of Easter, which would now be computed independent of the Hebrew calendar due to perceived errors in the Hebrew's most recently revised calculations for the date of Passover. Since the Egyptian competence had advanced expertise in this specialized field, Bishop Alexander was tasked with sponsoring this project. But note that the council did not deem Donatists as heretics. Also representing Africa's entire northwest, which was the center of the dissenting congregation, was only one person, Cecilian, whom the Donatists did not believe that their interest was represented. Well, that's it for the Africa-specific outcomes from the First Nicene Council. Now let's see how a disaster in the Red Sea led to Ethiopia's adoption of Christianity as its state religion. Christians had been in Ethiopia for over 300 years, ever since the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8:26-40, had returned home. However, it was the faith of two brothers that led to Ethiopia's king declaring Christianity as its state religion in 333 AD. Here's some scriptural background on Christianity in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains that Christianity was originally introduced to Ethiopia through the evangelist Philip. It was about 1 year after Jesus' ascension and just before Saul's conversion. Philip shared the gospel with the Ethiopian eunuch, who was the treasurer to Candace, queen of Ethiopia. Philip was referred to as the evangelist in Acts 21:8-9. He had 4 daughters who prophesied. See that in verse 9. Obviously, relations between Christians and the Aksumite Ethiopian authorities must have been cordial because Christians openly sold goods and worked throughout that territory. But here's the story about how the two brothers brought the gospel of Jesus Christ to the king of Ethiopia and Aksumite Empire. According to the historian Raphimus, around 313 AD, the Middle Eastern Christian Frumentius and his brother Edesius traveled with their uncle Metropius by ship from Tyre to Ethiopia. The story goes, either while at harbor in the Red Sea, their crew was slaughtered over a brawl, or they were shipwrecked and had lost their way. Either way, Frumentius and Edesius survived and were brought as slaves to the court of the Ethiopian king, Usanus, earning the king's favor. Both were elevated to positions of trust and freedom before he passed away. The king's widow and acting regent, Sophia, had the two remain in the court and tutor her young son, Izana. Using their influence within the kingdom, Frumentius and Edesius befriended Christian merchants living and working within the kingdom, along with converting Ethiopian Exumites to the Christian faith. Moreover, they converted and baptized the new king, who they mentored, Izana. But the success of these two formerly shipwrecked brothers doesn't end there. Ethiopia adopts Christianity as its state religion around 333 AD. By the way, by this date, Rome is still yet to adopt Christianity as its state religion. But let me say that Frumentius is honored in Ethiopian history as the Kese Berhan, which means revealer of light, and Abba Salama, father of peace, and the first Abban, head of the Coptic Church of Ethiopia. He is also credited with being the first to translate the New Testament into the Ethiopian writing system of Ge'ez. With 300 years of church history already, the Ethiopian Christian community had given today's church an amazing gift. We have Ethiopia to thank for the world's oldest illustrated Christian Bible. The color illustrations in the Garima Gospels are still vivid today. The 2-book volume has been dated between the 5th and 6th centuries AD. It is the 5th oldest book in the world today and the oldest bound book. Well, that's it for session 8. In session 9, we will cover dueling congregations, Donatists versus Nicaeans, effects of independent divergence. Rome adopts Nicene Christianity as its state religion. Donatists' apprehensions were painfully confirmed. Catholic imperialists' repression of Donatists. African Roman General Gildo's coup. More differentiating between Donatists and Nicaeans. We will continue in the mid to 4th century to early 5th century AD. Be in chapter 13 of your SCAR research manual. For the next 3 sessions, we will explore the locations, faith, and contributions of African Christians from the 1st to the 6th century AD, surveying Christianity's African roots by Jimmy D. Compton Jr. If you're interested in a spiral-bound book, you can purchase one through lulu.com, or if you're interested in a regularly bound book, you can purchase that through amazon.com. Like us on Facebook. Thank you. God bless you.